Okay. All right, we are live. Thank you everyone for coming today.
Awesome, thanks Jessica. Hi everyone, welcome to our seminar series. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jon Freeman. Jon is an associate professor of psychology and neuroscience at NYU, which is back home for him. He, in fact, he did his undergraduate at NYU after before a PhD at Tufts. There's a real underlying vision and coherence to Jon's work, all of which ask the question, how do we perceive and react to the social world? And in particular, how do we form split-second perceptions of other people? To that end, his lab studies topics like person perception, stereotyping and bias, and social categorization. He does all of this with a broad set of appropriate methods, including neuroimaging, computational modeling, and behavioral experiments. Jon's been the recipient of a host of awards, including most recently the Janet T. Spence Award for transformative early career contributions from the Association for Psychological Science. If all of this wasn't enough, let me just point out two more of Jon's ongoing contributions. First, he's the developer of Minder, of some mouse tracking software, which is used in thousands of labs across the world to get better behavioral measures. Second, he's done a host of work around trying to sort of better measure and resolve disparity amongst LGBT community with respect to STEM, including real attention to the details of things like how do we assert better policies so that we can actually measure this stuff better. So Jon, without further ado, the floor is yours. I'm looking forward to your talk.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me and for that really nice introduction. Sorry for the technical issues. I can't see any of you or see myself. So if something's very wrong, then just someone scream. Yeah, really excited to get your feedback on this work and to virtually meet all of you. So I'm going to be talking about our work over the past few years on the dynamic nature of social perception. And in thinking about this work, I often start by, I'm in New York City and thinking about, going around a busy street and seeing dozens, if not hundreds of different individuals in less than only a couple seconds. And one of the really interesting things about this process is that we can actually glean a lot of information from these very brief encounters. So if you stare at the center of the screen for a moment, that was 50 different people in less than 5 seconds. And a couple things you probably noticed. You probably noticed the gender, race, age, emotion of these people. And you also may have noticed that you're not that cognitively taxed. And so it's very easy for us to glean this kind of information. And when we think of each of these basic categorizations, we can think about this like a timeline where we're going from the onset of facial information to our ultimate categorization. And in the context of at least social psychology, there's been a lot of work looking at the products of these categorizations. So what their implications are for downstream interpersonal behavior and in social dynamics. There's been growing interest looking at, or had been, in the preconditions and things like processing demands or certain factors that might influence whether we encode or don't encode a given category, but really little work looking at the actual underlying process that gets perceivers from sensory information out in the world to their ultimate categorizations of other people. And this is a really fascinating question, I think, because when considering this in the context of social perception, there's a whole host of cues that are available. Not only are we talking about bottom-up cues of the face, and the face already is a complex stimulus with multiple features and multiple configurable properties. We're also talking about visual cues of the body and the environment and the context, as well as visual cues of the voice. And all of these bottom-up cues can influence these kinds of perceptions. But even more critically, things like prior knowledge and stereotypes, attitudes, or goals could also seep into this perceptual process itself, in some cases shifting our basic perceptions. And so you might be wondering why would this be the case, and shouldn't we be processing the visual world in a very faithful and vertical way? And I'll get into why we believe this is the case, but during this process, we'd be expecting these kinds of information sources to gradually integrate over time. And in terms of why, we've long known now that this is the way that the human brain would work, and particularly the perceptual system, where ongoing hypotheses generated by the ventral temporal cortex from direct information about a face are sent from lower level regions up to higher order regions. These higher order regions then incorporating the biases of top-down factors, in this case, things like learned knowledge, stereotypes about particular groups, could influence and send these kinds of adjustments back down to these lower level regions. These lower level regions then up to higher order regions, and through this ongoing interactive processing, the entire system comes to settle into a stable, steady state that would presumably reflect a kind of compromise between both the bottom-up cues available and top-down information sources. And I should say that when we're talking about stereotypes, we're talking about information, semantic knowledge that has been acquired, unfortunately, from one's culture, regardless of whether someone personally endorses this information or not. So we're really talking about the kind of semantic knowledge related to learned social categories that individuals have acquired from their social environment. And to look at this process, we often use a computer mouse tracking technique, as was already mentioned, functional neuroimaging, electrophysiology, and computational modeling to try to understand this. And what I'm going to be focusing on today is particularly this interplay between how we process other people's faces and our learned stereotypes, and how those can influence the way that we visually perceive other people. And I don't want to overly straw man this this feed-forward approach that has been kind of a predominant way of thinking for a while in this context of social perception, where generally we encounter another person, we represent this in some facial feature space of some kind, which then automatically activates a number of relevant social categories, which in turn activates related stereotypes, attitudes, and goals, which can then figure into behavior in perhaps non-conscious ways. But what we're really arguing is that this is a more interactive process where these things are bidirectionally related, such that as we're processing and activating a number of social categories, these activate things like stereotypes. And during the perceptual process itself, those stereotypes become a kind of implicit expectation that influences the processing of social categories and influences the representation even of particular facial features. So just to show this in a bit of a toy system, if we imagine a set of different facial features, of course, this could be, describable features as we're seeing here. This could be, a kind of pixel-based map. This could be a computational model of ventral visual processing. It could be however simple or complex you want it to be, but let's just start really simply, where we have a number of identifiable features. These are related to a number of social categories. These categories have mutually inhibitory connections between them to create kind of a competition, which I'm going to talk about shortly. These in turn automatically activate related semantic attributes, stereotypes, again, regardless of what someone endorses, but what they've learned from their culture. But critically, these activated stereotypes can then become a kind of implicit expectation that influences and facilitates the activation or inhibits the activation of, in this case, gender or racial categories, which in turn could even impinge on the featural representation of these different, of other people's faces. And this is a toy system. The actual modeling that we do is this is just a small part of clearly a much more complicated person perception system. We're just trying to capture a small portion of it. Now, this kind of modeling can be helpful for understanding phenomena, as I described, where these emerging findings of stereotypic vision, where this individual on the left is more readily categorized as white, this individual on the right is more readily categorized as black, due to stereotypic associations in the US, unfortunately, that link white individuals to higher status and black individuals to lower status. And similarly, due to associations with hostility, you see that this individual is more readily categorized as white, and this individual more readily categorized as black. And these are just example stimuli. There's many other, this was done with female targets and with different clothing attire. But the general idea is that these kinds of stereotypes, whether it be status or hostility, can lead to these unfortunate biases in our visual perception of other people. And on the one hand, this reflects the shocking effects of stereotypes, but from our perspective, this reflects domain general characteristics of an interactive perceptual system, right? So it's quite adaptive for the brain to use context and prior knowledge or lexical representations or knowledge of the English language to readily disambiguate this middle letter, just as it's adaptive for us to see this as a power drill in a garage context or a hairdryer in a bathroom context. So usually this is an adaptive idea, right, to use context and prior knowledge to constrain the possible interpretations that the visual system might make. But when we get into the context of social perception, we may be using prior learned knowledge that we would societally consider maladaptive. And just to show you, another example, a furry black cat walked through the door. It's very adaptive for us to disambiguate that A and middle A and H letter, right? We don't even notice that we're doing this. And this may be going on in the context of social perception. Now, how do we think this works at the neural level? When we encounter another person's face, the fusiform gyrus is going to be playing an important role in the representation of different facial features. We've known this particularly in the context of facial identity perception, and increasingly know about it in the context of social category perception. We believe that once, as information is getting processed by the fusiform, information is passed on to the anterior temporal lobe, which is involved in semantic processing, generally speaking, and is particularly involved in social semantic knowledge retrieval. And this region could be accessing things like stereotypes or person knowledge, which then could be used by the medial aspect of the orbitofrontal cortex. The orbitofrontal cortex, we think, is inconsistent with others, the work of others, can be using this information to form top-down visual predictions that then send feedback signals to the fusiform gyrus and to modulate how its representation of other people's faces to be partly more consistent with that knowledge. And this is consistent with work from Chris Summerfield's lab and from Moshe Bar's lab in terms of top-down priors in visual object recognition, for example, as well as some temporal dynamics characterized through MEG. And more recently, we've been extending this into not just thinking about these top-down, bottom-up interactions in the context of social category perception, but also in facial emotion perception and trait perception, which I'm going to talk about today, how all of this forms a kind of unified domain general perspective. So first going to start with our work on social categorization and then move into emotion perception and trait impressions to argue that for these kinds of dynamic interplay between bottom-up facial information and top-down social conceptual knowledge. So as I mentioned, if we go back to this toy model, we have a bunch of different facial features. These are related to a number of social categories. And we have these mutually inhibitory connections between these category representations. One of the reasons this is important is that there's a natural diversity and gradiency in other people's facial features. No one is the perfect prototype of a given gender or racial category, for example. And so to take the natural diversity that exists in the social world and slot it into these rigid categories, we need to have competitive processes, right, to take the multiply activated category representations and turn them into a stable percept that is categorical, that we readily use in person perception. So in our very initial work with this, it was very simple. We presented male and female faces that we manipulated to be slightly more sex atypical using morphing. So this face is slightly more feminine, this face is slightly more masculine. And using these kinds of faces, we used a computer mouse tracking technique. And unbeknownst to subjects, we are recording their hand movements and route to responses on the screen. And what we're interested in is the trajectory of their response-directed hand movement as the process is unfolding over time. This can give us a sense of to what extent multiple representations are being activated and influencing their categorization process. So this is showing you aggregated hand movements across all trials and all participants. And you're seeing that for the trajectories for the sex atypical male targets, there's a slight partial simultaneous attraction to select the opposite gender category, the female category, on the opposite side of the screen. Just as for the female targets, we see when there's some slight masculine features, there's this partial simultaneous attraction to select the male category response. And so this was some initial evidence that alternate social categories, both male and female, are being simultaneously activated and dynamically competing over time to stabilize onto a given social judgment. To statistically evaluate these kinds of effects, we take every single observed trajectory. This one seems to be particularly attracted to the opposite category response. And from that, calculate an idealized straight line trajectory. And from that, calculate things like maximum perpendicular deviation or area under the curve. And using these trial-by-trial measures of spatial attraction towards the opposite category response, in this case, we'll see a robust main effect of sex typicality, where trajectories for sex atypical targets shown in the lighter gray bars show much higher deviation than their sex typical counterparts in the darker gray bars. Since then, we've also shown this with real faces where a peripheral cue like hair has been manipulated. And of course, with other kinds of social category dimensions, we've shown this with race. And interestingly, there are some asymmetries in how different kinds of cues, the temporal dynamics and how they get processed. And this can be done with 3 and 4 choice paradigms as well. So for example, looking at how biracial and multiracial individuals are categorized and the presence of more reflexive monoracial category activation and the evaluative and behavioral implications of that reflexive monoracial activation for how we deal with other individuals. From a methodological point, before I continue, how we think about mouse tracking is that if we think of the classic stimulus response paradigm that has been obviously going on since the 1800s, like other kinds of measures, eye tracking, EEG or MEG, but rather than looking at kind of neural or visual attention patterns over time, what we're really doing here is looking at the discrete behavioral response itself, a button or a keyboard response, a measure like reaction time, and opening the response itself up into a continuous stream of cognitive output where the motor trajectory response is actually coextensive with the underlying cognitive or social cognitive process. And I developed a software package a while ago that's freely available online. There are also some more recent open source packages for analysis suites. But in terms of this technique, not only can you get at kind of multiple response activation, but also using looking at the distributions of patterns, you can answer theoretical questions about single versus dual system or single versus dual process models, as well as get a millisecond resolution time course of how different factors are getting computed during an evolving decision process. And just to give you an example of the findings I just mentioned on how multiple social categories are getting activated, is important from a mechanistic perspective. It's also important from understanding real world outcomes. And so in one study, to just give you an example of those kinds of outcomes, we looked at from 1998 to 2010 senator and governor electoral candidates in the US. And we asked participants to just simply categorize the gender of these faces as quickly and accurately as possible. And what we found was that exclusively for the female politicians, the more masculine that a female politician essentially was perceived early in processing, the less likely she was to win her electoral contest. So the more masculine she was perceived, the less likely she was to win her electoral contest, more specifically predicted a decreased margin of victory, even when controlling for perceived attractiveness and perceived competence, other facial factors that have long been known to influence both male and female politicians' electoral success or failure. What this may suggest is that there's an additional barrier that female politicians, and I should say this was particularly observed for female politicians running in conservative constituencies. You're seeing the extent to which they're perceived to be masculine with the decreased margin of victory. This is really happening for those politicians running in conservative states, not really happening for those running in liberal states. So female politicians running in conservative constituencies, not only do they need to appear attractive and competent from their facial features, which male politicians need to as well, but they also need to retain ties to traditional femininity at the level of facial appearance, perhaps. So this is just one example of the kinds of outcomes from these very basic kind of early perceptual dynamics that are occurring. But moving forward in the main focus of this talk in terms of how do our stereotypes influence this process of perceiving others' faces, one way is that context cues could kick this process off. So to give you an example, as I alluded to earlier, if we ask participants to categorize the race of these faces, especially when the face is racially ambiguous, participants are biased by their status stereotypes. But even when participants make the exact same categorization outcome for an identical face, when surrounded by, in this case, low status attire, participants were partially attracted to the stereotypically associated category response, even before ultimately selecting their ultimate, their judgment in this instance, right? So what this is suggesting is that even if our perceptual outcomes and the categorizations are not influenced by something like our learned stereotypes, it can still be that the process is considerably biased by these stereotypes. And it's possible that with the mere activation of, in this case, the Black category or other kinds of categories, this could have implications for evaluation and behavior well after the perceptual outcome has finalized. But how does this information, right, this kind of interaction between the perceptual accrual, bottom-up accrual of these facial features and our top-down expectations here, how is that occurring at the neural level is something we've long been interested in. And to get at this question initially, we used the idea of intersectionality as a lens into this process generally. So when we think of these different category dimensions that you're seeing on the screen, race, emotion, and sex, these have nothing to do with one another in reality. But from a psychological perspective, these are confounded with one another due to stereotypic associations. So for example, if we think of race and sex, and we think of the stereotype contents that are related to, for example, the Black and male categories, there are stereotypes that are, of course, exclusively related to the Black and male categories, but there are a whole host of stereotypes that are incidentally shared between these different categories. Similarly, for Asian and female, there are some, stereotypes exclusive to these, but there's a whole host of stereotypes incidentally shared between these categories. And from the perspective of our model, what this would suggest is that as we're processing the race of a face, for example, it's going to automatically activate related stereotypes, which in turn could facilitate the activation of the male category and impinge on a more masculine featural representation. Similarly, we would expect this for Asian and female. So even though these social categories are independent in reality, due to overlapping stereotypes, they can become directly confounded with one another, perhaps at the level of visual perception. And just behaviorally, with a number of studies, we've shown that as you're categorizing a male face, if it's Black relative to white or Asian, categorizations of gender or race are quicker, they get more efficient, whether you're using mouse tracking or reaction time tasks. And similarly, or I should say conversely, for female faces, as you're, when it's Asian relative to white or Black, they're categorized more quickly. So when they're stereotypically congruent, when gender and racial stereotypes are overlapping essentially, then categorizations of gender and race get a little bit quicker, is what we're finding. So we know that sex and race overlap, as I just mentioned, in terms of Black gets tied to male and Asian gets tied to female in stereotypes. And we know also that sex and emotion have stereotypic overlap. There's a lot of attention on the idea that men are stereotyped as displaying anger and women are stereotyped as displaying joy. If we think of in the media, Hillary Clinton should be smiling more. This has entered our popular conversations about this issue. But if you measure stereotypes, this is very clear. And then race and emotion, as I alluded to earlier, where Black individuals are stereotyped through hostility as more likely to display anger. And there has been evidence behaviorally that these all influence categorizations. And so all of these overlap to some extent. And so our approach was to, if we imagine, let's just take the example of the fusiform gyrus, of course, with neuroimaging, we're not measuring actual neurons, we're just measuring multivoxel patterns. But just for illustrative purposes, what we would imagine if this brain region is involved in coding for gender is that it would have some multivoxel pattern associated with the male category. And it would also have some multivoxel pattern associated with the female category. But if we assume for a moment that this region also codes for race, then this region will also have, patterns for race categories. And what we can look at is the similarity structure, or in this case, how similar is this black neural pattern to the male versus female pattern, right? So in this case, we would say that black and male have higher similarity, whereas black and female have lower similarity or correlation in their neural patterns. So what we did in our beginning with this work is present male and female, black, white, and Asian, angry and happy faces. So all crossed with one another. We did this both naturalistically in one fMRI study. In a second fMRI study, we controlled for low-level visual features and made this monochrome and replicated the effects. So they're simply passively viewing these faces in the scanner. After the scan, they are categorizing each of these faces by gender, race, or emotion. And so they get one face at a time per usual in these mouse tracking tasks. This is just to show you kind of our predictions, where for a white face, we're not expecting there to be a strong bias either way by gender. But when categorizing a black face, for example, just one at a time, we'd expect when they categorize it as male, it's going to be extremely direct and facilitated. And when they categorize it as female, it's going to be slightly attracted to the male category response and a little bit more indirect, right, due to this stereotypic association. And using mouse tracking data, we can say in this case that black and male would have higher perceptual similarity and black and female would have lower perceptual similarity according to these patterns of mouse tracking data. And if you're interested in exactly how we did this, happy to answer after. But using this pattern of mouse tracking data, we can generate a similarity structure of the Asian, white, black, male, female, happy, and angry categories, and how similar or dissimilar they are perceptually, according to mouse tracking. And if we use multidimensional scaling, what we'll see is just what we've known from the literature, that black and male are more perceptually similar than black and female, and that male and happy are less similar than male and angry, and female and happy are male and happy are further away than male and angry. Female and happy are closer together, more similar than female and angry. So there's nothing really new about that. That's sort of getting the various findings. We're replicating the findings in the literature and getting it into a common framework here. We also asked our subjects to rate these 7 categories on 96 different traits. For example, to what extent do most people believe that Asian people are, and then they rate intelligent, sociable from 1 to 7. Now, the reason we ask to what extent do most people believe is to reduce social desirability. We're not interested in what people personally endorse. Obviously, that's going to be very different from what people know. This is really to tap what their knowledge is, what they've acquired from their culture. We're not interested in what they personally believe or endorse. And when you can generate in this way another similarity structure based on their social conceptual knowledge or their stereotypes in terms of how similarly or dissimilarly are they rating on these 96 traits, Asian, Black, etc. And our analytic approach was to look at how the representational structure of stereotypes and conceptual knowledge might predict the representational structure of social perception, which in turn might predict the representational structure of particular brain regions' neural patterns, and then which brain regions are those. And so just to take this in hand, let's imagine one of these pairs where we have the social conceptual knowledge about Black individuals and about anger and angry individuals, where if a subject believes that these are more overlapping and believes that Black and anger have more conceptual overlap, that in turn predicts a greater bias to perceive Black faces as angrier, even though they aren't, right? So to perceive Black and angry faces as more similar, which in turn predicts increased neural pattern similarity between and neural patterns when viewing Black and angry faces in the scanner. So indeed, this is showing you the first part of that, where on the x-axis we have each pair of stereotypes and each pair of categories in stereotype knowledge. On the y-axis, each pair of categories in mouse tracking and perception, and each slope is a subject, and we're seeing this positive association. So the extent to which these are more similar stereotypically, they become more similar in visual perception. And in turn, this was reflected in the neural representational structure of the right fusiform gyrus, this critical face processing region, as well as the medial aspect of the orbitofrontal cortex, which is involved, we think, in these top-down visual predictions that are modulating the fusiform gyrus. Now, it's important to control for potential bottom-up visual differences. Even though we control for low-level visual properties and match them in a replication study, we also need to control for various models of overlap in the stimuli themselves. So we used computational models of ventral visual representation of how the fusiform in a purely bottom-up fashion would be processing these images, as well as pixel intensity maps. So using the information in the images themselves to make sure that even if there are any overlaps, which by chance can easily occur, or for other reasons, that there's overlap in the stimuli related to anger and male, for example. Even if you statistically adjust for this, we still saw these effects in the fusiform and in the orbitofrontal cortex. And so what this suggests is that faces are being represented in an inherently stereotypically biased fashion in the right fusiform gyrus and the medial orbitofrontal cortex. Based on, so if you're an individual that stereotypically believes that Black is closer to male, Asian is closer to female, or that male is closer to anger, stereotypically, this becomes a reality in visual perception. And in turn, this is reflected in the neural representational structure of these faces in the visual system, in the fusiform, and in the OFC, is what these data suggest. So we've been extending this kind of approach to understand more generally other aspects of person perception, and in particular, emotion perception from a general, in a very general standpoint. So for this, we've often used reverse correlation. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but the idea is that we start with a base face, which is sort of an average of a number of different faces, and we superimpose noise patterns on top of that base face, and add some filtering, and this creates some kind of features that generates an interesting perception for the subjects. And then in a forced choice decision task on, say, hundreds of trials, we'll ask, choose the face that looks more angry. They make a decision, choose the face that looks more angry, etc. And we'll average all of those noise patterns together to generate a composite that reflects, in this case, an anger classification image, which from, even though we just started with one base image and didn't make any a priori assumptions about what the features are, we now have a kind of visual prototype of what's in their mind's eye, what are they expecting when they think of anger. And if you use this reverse correlation task for male and female and for anger and joy, what you see, which is probably evident, is that male overlaps with anger, female overlaps with joy a little bit, and joy overlaps with female, and anger overlaps with male, right? Which is what we've been expecting. So not only that in the aggregate, but if you ask subjects on 40 different items, I'm showing you here, to rate from 1 to 7, anger, joy, male and female on these different kinds of emotion-related attributes, what you find is that there are strong individual differences with this. So basically, I'm just showing you this schematically here, but let's just take one of the pairs of categories, anger and male. If you stereotypically believe that male is more tied to anger in your mind, this in turn predicts classification images in a reverse correlation task that are much more stereotypically biased. So the anger classification image looks much more masculine. The male classification image looks much more angry. And this was iterated across all the possible options. And so what this suggests is that biased visual prototypes of, that there are biased visual prototypes of gender and emotion categories, which are related to how strong your stereotypical associations are. So this is another way to converge on the same idea of how stereotypes are influencing our perceptions. And most recently with this gender and emotion interaction in a neuroimaging study, we actually, to understand the interplay between the fusiform and the OFC better, we rendered these faces actually subjectively invisible using backward masking. And so we have these faces, we're presenting them in the scanner, and we have a backward mask. So these are only presented for 33 milliseconds. After the scan, they're getting mouse tracking and stereotype tasks. And there's a subliminal condition where the face is masked. And then just to control for that, in a superliminal condition, they can obviously see the face, but we're essentially masking the pattern mask. But it's just to control for the visual information. And you might be aware, but there's a lot of work with backward masking, looking at and neural correlates of consciousness work, where essentially backward masking, most current theories suggest that you're getting spared limited ventral visual processing. You're getting more local processing that is spared in terms of processing visual images out or backward masked, and they're relatively disconnected from the rest of the brain. So we thought that we could use backward masking to kind of isolate processing within just the fusiform that's relatively disconnected from the orbitofrontal cortex. And I don't have time to go into the details, but we confirmed with psychophysiological interaction analyses that indeed this did occur. And what we found, here's just a schematic in the interest of time, but if you're interested, please ask me after, is that basically what we're seeing evidence for is that the fusiform is processing faces as they are initially. And then information is sent to the OFC, which has that stereotypic information, which then, as I've been arguing, can influence partly representational structure in the fusiform. But when we relatively disconnect this using backward masking, we see that masked stimuli are kind of de-biasing fusiform representations. That when we look at the representational structure in the fusiform for masked stimuli, even though they're subjectively invisible, we're seeing representations in the fusiform that are de-biased and relatively faithful to the actual information. And what this suggests is that really that this information is influencing, the OFC is influencing the fusiform on the fly in the moment. Another possibility was that through long-term learning, it starts to influence the lateral connections and sort of the long-term representational structure in the fusiform by itself. These data suggest that it's more on the fly, but we want to expand on this work, obviously, before making a strong conclusion there. More generally, this work, which is gender and emotion, has expanded our thinking about emotion perception more generally. And when we think of emotion perception in affective science, as I'm sure many of you are aware, there is a very long-standing idea of the basic emotions going back to Charles Darwin and certainly carried forward by Paul Ekman, where we presumably directly read out these facial expressions of emotion with these particular action units on a face, as if the information is all on the face, and we have these discrete brain systems and discrete representations for these emotions. That is, by today's standard, an extreme straw man, but just to kind of historically give you that perspective. And consistent with work on the conceptual act model and the theory of constructed emotion, and these ideas by Lisa Feldman Barrett and Russell and others, our dynamic interactive approach is also suggesting that conceptual knowledge here would help construct and change the way that we process these emotions generally, putting aside things like stereotypes. So for example, as we're processing this emotion expression, if we are someone that conceptually believes that anger and disgust are more similar for whatever reason, those categories might be more overlapping, and in turn, that might change the way that we visually perceive these facial expressions. And what we did was a very simple set of mouse tracking studies where, we have the 6 quote basic emotions, and they get all the different options in terms of 2-choice responses. And after these mouse tracking tasks, we asked them on those 40 items of emotion related items to rate each of these 6 categories on how much these categories involve this kind of conceptual knowledge. And again, and schematically, what we're predicting is very similar to what I talked about earlier, where if you're someone that believes that, for example, anger and disgust are more similar conceptually, this will predict a greater bias to perceive faces as disgusted or angry, to see angry faces as more disgusted or disgusted faces as more angry, or to have reverse correlated prototypes that are more resembling one another physically. Anger and disgust prototypes look more similar to one another. And this is just showing you the mouse tracking data. Each slope is a subject. And on the x-axis, you're seeing conceptual similarity. And on the y-axis, you're seeing perceptual similarity with mouse tracking. And we see this overall positive association across the board. To show you the reverse correlation results, here's a low tertile for those who don't think that anger and sadness, in this case, think that they're very conceptually different. These are individuals that think they're conceptually quite similar. And you see that these look more resembling one another than these, which look more distinct. And so this suggests that emotion concept knowledge is also, as we're seeing with social category perception, providing a kind of conceptual scaffolding for facial emotion perception. And in more recent work, we basically replicated these effects behaviorally and also show that they manifest in the right fusiform. So the neural representational structure of these 6 emotion categories when viewing faces is influenced by the conceptual knowledge. And that's what we're seeing even within the visual system in the fusiform gyrus, suggesting that individual differences in emotion concepts that people just have subtly learned are reflected in these visual face processing regions. Okay, so just very quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, just to kind of complete the trifecta here of social category perception, emotion perception, and trait perception. Now, unlike social category and emotion perception, trait perception from faces seems a lot more arbitrary and subjective, perhaps, but there's considerable research showing that from the regular sets of facial features, we make very consistent impressions of these faces. And so, for example, this face is readily seen as trustworthy. This is very untrustworthy. And when thinking of all the possible personality traits we might make, trustworthiness, dominance, competence, etc., research has looked at what is the dimensional structure of this, right? There's thousands of possible judgments we could make. Is there some kind of lower dimensional structure? And indeed, it's been argued that there is this trustworthiness dimension, which is the bulk of it's 70% of the variance or so in these in trait evaluations. It's basically a positive, negative, good, bad evaluation, and then an independent dimension of dominance. So you can think about this as reading other people's intentions, good or bad, and then the ability to enact those intentions of how able or unable, dominant or submissive. And this is in line with a lot of other ideas in social cognition that have argued for these universal dimensions of, in this case, warmth and competence, trustworthiness and dominance, very similar ideas. But it's argued that for functionally adaptive reasons, we have universal dimensions and a kind of universal fixed architecture for processing these attributes from other people. And from our perspective, I've just been spending all this time talking about this little toy system over here. This has lived in a slightly different literature and world empirically than all this growing and research on how very specific facial features map onto these very specific traits. And it just does not stand to reason that these would live in functionally independent worlds, right? We know, as just one very obvious example, that women are stereotyped as being, or are stereotypically prescribed to be appeasing and not dominant. And so when you have a dominant woman or a powerful woman, that can be counter-stereotypical and lead to harsh evaluations, which is well established. So this work on trait impressions has been kind of in a vacuum of young white male faces without much context. But when you start to contextualize it with gender and race or with other kinds of context or perceiver differences, you see that these fundamental dimensions of trustworthiness and dominance are not actually independent, right? They start to collapse on one another or change. And so we've been using this kinds of similar representational similarity approaches to understand this process. And to just give you one example, in the very same logic as what I've been telling you about, if you're processing another person's face and you happen to believe that, for example, agreeableness and openness are more similar, that these tend to go together, that they're more similar ideas, you'll perceive these as more similar when processing others' faces. And this kind of rigid universal architecture starts to become a lot more flexible and varying across perceivers. So there's a lot here, but if you just focus on the right, these are showing you reverse correlated images for perceivers that believe that agreeableness and openness are very conceptually similar. And you see that their prototypes of these look very similar, whereas perceivers that think that openness and agreeableness are very different have very different facial prototypes for that. So showing you that conceptual beliefs, again, are scaffolding the perception of facial impressions and trait impressions. Okay, so to wrap up, showed you how conceptual knowledge is structuring each of these kinds of perceptions. And just to go back where we started, right? Each of these perceptions and categorizations there's all this social conceptual knowledge that's coming into play to influence these perceptions. And across the board, whether it be social category perception, emotion perception, or trait perception, we're generally seeing a consistent overall finding. And I just want to reiterate that, you know, there are unique social aspects here, but for better or for worse, these are drawing on domain general mechanisms, right? In terms of this is usually something that's adaptive for many instances of perception, but in the context of social category perception, this can become maladaptive. However, when we think about emotion perception or trait perception, we could think about this in an adaptive way. So this just further highlights when things are maladaptive here, how difficult, unfortunately, it is to intervene on this because we have mechanisms that are usually being frequently used for quite adaptive purposes. And again, this is evidence for this interplay in particular between the fusiform and the orbitofrontal cortex. And so a couple quick take-homes. What this suggests is that initial social perceptions are hardly initial, right? The stereotypes are coming into play, for example, before we even get to make our initial perceptions. Stereotypes and other social conceptual knowledge shape the basic perception of social categories, emotions, and traits. Bias can manifest at the level of face perception. Again, domain general mechanisms we believe are at the heart of this. And as I alluded to a little bit, it's important to zoom in on these initial dynamics, not only for a mechanistic understanding of this process and to create better ways to intervene on these maladaptive aspects, but also that initial perceptual dynamics have downstream social consequences, the politician's success or failure, and a number of other studies we've looked at where even what's going on before a categorization matters. So with that, I just want to thank the members of my lab and my collaborators, funding agencies that supported this work, and thank you all for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions, although I can't see anyone or myself.
Awesome. Thanks so much, John, for that sort of fascinating, provocative talk. There are a bunch of questions sort of slowly starting to come in. And so let me just start with the first one. So this is a question from Ariana. I'll just read it to you. What about learned trait face associations for familiar individuals? For example, suppose you learn a trait of a specific coworker that goes against pre-existing stereotypic associations. Would you still expect feedback modulations of population responses in FG? Would you still expect, for example, deviations in mouse tracking?
I missed the first part of that.
Yeah, so suppose you learn a trait of a specific coworker that goes against your pre-existing stereotypic associations. Would you still see these effects?
Yeah, so that, I mean, and this has sort of been at the center stage of social cognition work in terms of categorical impressions versus individuated impressions. And what you're getting at is how do we incorporate individuated knowledge about particular exemplars into and do that? And it's a whole, I think in this context, we're just starting to look at actually facial identity perception and individuated knowledge. I would expect that I do still think you would see these effects, but I think there would be an interesting temporal dynamic that fMRI is not, suited for, where the individuated knowledge comes into play a little bit, later. And so if you have knowledge, counter stereotypic information, or that this person is not consistent with your stereotypes, that you will resolve that. But earlier on, you might see a strong categorical bias potentially. But it's a great question that we'd love to look at in the future.
Right. That totally makes sense. Alice Chai has a question. When executive functions are diminished by some secondary non-social task, how do you think that might impact the relationship between existing stereotypic knowledge and on-the-fly social categorizing? So what's going on when the executive functions are diminished by doing something other than the social task?
Interesting. Yeah, the way that we think about these processes is that they're fully associative, and don't require any kind of cognitive resources. However, in some studies, we have found that to resolve some of these conflicts, we see for the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, for example, coming online that is related to multivoxel patterns in the fusiform. And what that is suggesting to us perhaps is that when, if there's a lot of information to integrate, you might need some conflict monitoring regions to help assist in that, but we don't know what exactly, if that's just simply, it could just be as simple as it's directing more attentional resources to help figure out, what understand this person in this phase, or it could be actually that the competitive dynamics themselves that we believe are fully associative and don't require cognitive resources do require cognitive resources, right? So I'm very open to the idea that that's possible, but the way that we've modeled it and thought about it before is that this doesn't really require cognitive resources.
Great.
Or executive function, yeah.
There's a question from Kenji Kobayashi. Do you have any comments on the time course of associations that one is consciously aware of versus unaware of? So what would happen, for example, if the participant is explicitly made aware of potential associations in the instructions? Could awareness affect time course in a way that can be measured by mouse tracking?
Yeah, interesting. So we've just begun to think about that in terms of goals and awareness and these kinds of manipulations to see how these stereotypic vision effects are influenced. I think from a methodological standpoint, certainly mouse tracking will be able to be sensitive to that. And we've done work with emotion perception and cognitive resources in terms of a cognitive load manipulation, or other researchers have done things with awareness. And you certainly would expect differences. I think for us, it's an open question what would happen if you make people aware that you are, your visual perceptions are being biased, and how would you, can you change that? We're very interested in that for sure.
Awesome. So we're exactly at time. I'm sorry we can get to the other questions, but please do feel free to follow up with Jon offline if you have questions about his work. I'm sure he'd be happy to hear from you. Jon, I'll just point out that there are lots of people in the comments. I'm giving you a round of sort of well-deserved applause. So thank you so much for joining us. Thanks everybody else for joining us. And as Jessica says, we hope to see you at our next seminar next Friday at 12 p.m. with Dr. Turnbull from Stanford. So thanks again, everybody.
Thanks for having me.